Tonight, we have the opportunity again to slip away from the present and into a time when humans weren't just gazing at the moon, they were landing on it. The glow from your screen flickers as grainy black and white footage slowly comes into focus. You can almost hear the hushed breathing of 100 million people all glued to their TVs, radios and transistor sets. In living rooms from California to Calcutta, families squint at the screen as a tiny white figure descends a ladder and utters words that will echo for generations. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But behind those cheers, behind all the hugging and champagne and fireworks, another sound begins to rise, not applause, but skepticism, whispers, side eyes, and somewhere in the halls of Soviet power, a frown. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is over there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in the sticky July heat of 1969. America is buzzing. There's a parade of flags, networks interrupting everything with live updates, and Walter Cronkite visibly holding back tears. The Saturn V had launched flawlessly days earlier from Cape Canaveral, and now millions are watching from a world away as Neil Armstrong's boot meets lunar dust. You, though, are somewhere different. Imagine yourself not in Florida, but in a Soviet apartment block in Leningrad. The TV is off. The newspaper has a terse mention of an alleged American lunar event. There's borscht on the stove and an older man muttering bar capitalist theatre. Because while the American press treats it as the triumph of the century, in the USSR reactions range from icy silence to thinly veiled derision. Pravda, the state newspaper, devotes its front page not to the moon, but to a harvest report and a speech by Brezhnev. The moon landing page, 5 bottom left, maybe. For ordinary Soviets, especially the ones who had grown up watching Laika Gagarin and Tereshkova soar into orbit, the idea that America had leapfrogged ahead overnight was unpalatable. Sure, they landed, some said with a scoff, on a film set in Nevada. You wouldn't have found many openly hostile reactions, but among scientists and engineers there were whispers. Quiet curiosity wrapped in professional envy. After all, the USSR had its own lunar ambitions, and they'd been mysteriously silent about them for years. At NASA's Mission Control in Houston, though nobody's talking about Soviet reactions, they're exhausted. Running on caffeine and adrenaline, engineers sit slumped in front of glowing monitors, letting out long, shaky exhales. Armstrong and Aldrin have done it. Michael Collins is still in orbit. Everything is miraculously going according to plan. But even here, amid the triumph, some technicians exchange wary looks. The success feels a little too perfect. What if something had gone wrong? Here's a fun fringe tidbit for you. NASA had actually prepared a presidential speech titled "In Event of Moon Disaster." In it, Nixon would somberly inform the world that the astronauts had been stranded and will stay on the moon to rest in peace. The fact that this speech even existed gave fuel to the doubters later on, because if a plan for failure existed, couldn't a backup plan for fakery exist too? Historians still argue whether the moon landing's immediate global impact matched its long-term legacy. Some say it unified humanity, gave children hope, expanded our imagination. Others argue it was mostly an American spectacle quickly forgotten outside the West. In Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, for instance, most citizens didn't even see the landing until years later, if ever. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, in a desert somewhere outside of Perth, Australia, a group of amateur radio operators huddled around a satellite dish, tracking the Apollo signal for themselves. They confirmed the broadcast, real voices, real telemetry. But ask conspiracy theorists today and they'll tell you Australia was in on it too. Back in your imaginary Soviet kitchen, the old man sips his tea. He doesn't believe it. He won't. He's seen too much Cold War deception to trust a blurry TV broadcast. They needed a win, he mumbles, poking at his cabbage. They built a story. You're still in that kitchen in Leningrad, the wallpaper, slightly peeling the bulb overhead, flickering now and then. Outside, snow's begun to drift lightly across the street. Even though it's July, it's just that kind of surreal night. Across the table, the man stirs his tea again, though it's long gone cold. They say the Americans walked on the moon. He grunts more to himself than to you. Funny, you'd think if it were real we would have seen more than television, fuzz, and propaganda. He's not alone. As the world processed Armstrong's lunar leap, the official Soviet response was oddly muted. No grand press conference, no congratulatory telegram from the Kremlin. Pravda's one-liner coverage gave no hint of admiration, just a sterile summary of an alleged event, followed by a reminder of Soviet scientific achievements. It wasn't denial, not quite, but it was certainly not celebration either. In public, Soviet scientists towed the party line, cool disinterest. Privately, however, many were stunned. These were men and women who dedicated their lives to beating the Americans to space. They'd launched Sputnik, flown the first human-sent probes to the moon before NASA had even finalized its Apollo design. And now, the Americans had actually done it. Inside Soviet research institutes, late-night meetings cropped up. Radio engineers pored over telemetry data. Astronomers adjusted their observatories to track Apollo's path retroactively. And perhaps most quietly of all cosmonauts, those select few national heroes who'd ridden gloriously into orbit stared in silence at the replays. Some reportedly were impressed. A few others shook their heads. You wonder if the Soviets didn't believe it, wouldn't they have made a louder fuss, called it a fraud on the world stage? But no, they didn't. And that silence, that quiet vacuum of doubt, was enough for conspiracy to grow. After all, the Soviet Union was very good at loudly pointing out capitalist lies. Their silence here felt strange, strategic even. In Moscow, a few professors began to murmur in academic circles about inconsistencies. Why was there no crater under the lunar module? Why didn't the flag ripple properly, or why did it ripple at all? Why in some photos were there no stars? Even though these points have since been debunked 1,000 times over, they took root. The whispers had momentum now, and the Soviet government, perhaps amused, perhaps indifferent, did little to stamp them out. In contrast, the streets of Moscow remained calm. A few televisions, those lucky enough to catch international broadcasts, had shown parts of the moonwalk, but the clips were chopped late and aired with heavy state commentary. One translation reportedly described the mission as a symbolic step, though, of questionable scientific merit, subtle enough to avoid full-on denial, strong enough to sow skepticism. Meanwhile, Soviet schoolchildren continued memorizing the glories of Gagarin and the Vostok missions. And when one boy dared ask his teacher, "Didn't the Americans land on the moon?" she reportedly replied with a smile, "Some Americans said they did." And just like that, seeds of doubt were sown between the cracks of indoctrination. Here's your quirky tidbit for this section. While America had Neil Armstrong, the Soviet Union quietly trained Valentin Bondarenko as a lunar cosmonaut before his tragic death in a training accident. He died in a fire similar to the Apollo 1 crew, except his story was buried for decades. Had he lived, history might have unfolded differently, but history, as always, favors the storyteller. Historians still argue whether the Soviet government genuinely doubted the moon landing or merely found political convenience in pretending to. Some documents hint at genuine disbelief among mid-level officials, especially those not deeply embedded in the aerospace program. Others believe the USSR knew the truth almost immediately, but chose to let the American achievement stand, knowing that public doubt left to fester could hurt the US more than any official rebuttal. At the Cosmodrome in Baikonur, Kazakhstan, technicians went back to work on the Soyuz program. The moon was by now drifting further away, not just astronomically, but politically. The USSR had poured resources into their own lunar dream, but setbacks and secrecy had hobbled them. With the Americans suddenly victorious, the Soviets seemed to choose a new path, deny the moon its glory, and focus instead on orbital science space stations and long-term endurance. But in the hearts of many citizens, something shifted. A fracture. For years they had been told they were winning the space race. They had cheered when dogs went to orbit, when Yuri Gagarin smiled his unforgettable smile. And now they were being told it didn't matter, that the moon didn't matter. And yet in the background, the Americans were laughing, hugging, moonwalking. It created a quiet psychological crisis, like waking from a dream where you'd already won only to realize someone else crossed the finish line first. So people like the old man across the table from you found comfort in cynicism. "It's not real," he mutters again. "Americans just want a show." But you've seen that boot print. You've heard the grainy audio, the beeps, the tension. Still doubt lingers in that room. It always will, especially when the official silence makes more noise than a shout. You lean back, eyes half closed, as the crackling hum of that Leningrad apartment fades into memory, and you're tugged backward through the foggy corridors of the 1960s, a time when the world spun just a little faster. The so-called space race wasn't just about stars or science. It was about power, ego, and political theater on a planetary stage. You might think the Americans were always in the lead, but no. In the beginning, it was the Soviets who held the spotlight. Your journey starts with a beep, an impossibly simple, repetitive beep that pulsed from Sputnik 1 in October 1957, shocking the world. It was the sound of the Soviet Union planting its flag in the heavens first. Schoolchildren in Kansas wept, the Pentagon panicked, and just like that, the race was on. Then came Laika, the doomed dog, drifting into eternity with no return ticket. Then Yuri Gagarin, charming and fearless, became the first human in space in 1961. He orbited Earth once and returned a hero, his smile practically weaponized by Soviet propaganda. Back in the United States, the early space efforts looked clumsy. Rockets exploded, test flights ended in failure. American astronauts were daring, yes, but they seemed constantly to be catching up. Soviet firsts piled up like trophies. First woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. First multiple-person crew. First spacewalk. Each success was paraded through Red Square like a floating victory banner. And for a while the moon didn't matter, at least not yet. The Soviets were playing the long game, mastering low Earth orbit, building endurance, showcasing control. American prestige, meanwhile, took hit after hit. But something changed in 1961 when President John F. Kennedy, with almost reckless optimism, stood before Congress and pledged that the US would land a man on the moon before the decade was out. No one quite knew how that was going to happen, not even NASA. But Kennedy had fired the starting gun for a new kind of race, a longer, riskier, more glorious one. And from that moment forward, the game tilted. Quietly at first, the US started pouring billions into the Apollo program. Factories buzzed, launch sites expanded, and thousands of engineers worked around the clock. America wasn't trying to beat the Soviets in orbit anymore. They were planning to leapfrog them entirely. Yet you might ask, where were the Soviets during this shift? Why didn't they counter with their own lunar program? Well, they tried, desperately. Behind closed doors, a plan to reach the moon was taking shape. But secrecy was both their armor and their Achilles heel. Few outside the top echelons even knew the full scope of the effort. Unlike NASA, which published technical specs and held press conferences, the Soviets were veiled in silence. Every failure was erased from public record. Every disaster buried beneath bureaucratic language. You only ever saw the successes. Here's the fringe detail. Most people forget the Soviets had their own massive moon rocket, the N-1. It was taller than the Statue of Liberty and twice as loud as your neighbor's leaf blower. But it failed spectacularly, 4 times. One explosion in 1969, the same year of Apollo 11, was so huge it flattened the launch pad and blew out windows in nearby towns. And yet, it was never officially acknowledged until decades later. Historians still argue whether the Soviets ever truly intended to go to the moon, or whether it was a bluff to keep the Americans on edge. Some say Korolev, the chief Soviet rocket designer, believed in the lunar dream until the end. Others argue that once he died in 1966, the Soviet space program lost its soul and its direction. And now we must talk about Korolev, because if Kennedy was the face of America's moon mission, then Sergei Korolev was the invisible architect of the Soviet effort. A genius, a survivor of Stalin's gulags and a master of innovation, Korolev had guided every major Soviet first in space. But his identity was kept secret, known only as the chief designer. When he died unexpectedly during surgery in January 1966, the entire program faltered. His death wasn't just a loss of talent, it was a loss of cohesion. Petty rivalries erupted. Competing design bureaus bickered over rocket blueprints like jealous siblings fighting over the family will. With Korolev gone and Apollo roaring forward, the Soviets began to pivot. Unwilling to admit defeat, they turned towards space stations and long-term missions instead. The moon was still theoretically on the table, but by the time 1969 rolled around, it was clear if anyone was going to touch lunar soil first, it wouldn't be the red-flagged cosmonauts. And yet Soviet citizens didn't know this. The failures were hidden, the N-1 rocket never mentioned. The missed chances redacted. So when the Americans planted their flag, a psychic dissonance took hold. But we were winning, thought the ordinary Muscovite. We always won. And when reality didn't match the narrative, suspicion rushed in to fill the gap. So now you understand how this argument over the moon began, not just with one small step, but with years of uneven pacing, secret programs and propaganda battles. The Americans might have planted their flag first, but it was the Soviets who taught the world to look up and believe the sky could be conquered. The hum of old engines long silenced echoes softly as you drift deeper into the Soviet lunar dream, one that began with confidence and ended in crumbling blueprints. Somewhere beneath Kazakhstan's pale steppe, sky-forgotten fragments of rockets sleep beneath tarps, and with them the memory of a man without whom the Soviets never stood a chance, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. You follow him now, not as a ghost but as a shadow, moving through history. Korolev was not the face of Soviet spaceflight. In fact, until after his death, most of the world didn't even know his name. Referred to only as the chief designer, he was a man both revered and feared. A survivor of the Gulag beaten, starved, nearly broken, he had re-emerged with a vengeance, carrying the dream of turning Sputnik into something far bigger. And for a while it worked. He gave the Soviets Gagarin, he gave them Vostok and Soyuz, but he also held tightly to a vision that the USSR could go to the moon and beat the Americans there. That dream, though, depended entirely on him. And in 1966, after years of overwork and unspoken illness, Korolev died on the operating table during what was supposed to be routine surgery. His heart gave out, or maybe some say the years of prison and stress finally claimed their due. Historians still argue whether his death alone doomed the Soviet lunar program, but what's clear is this: after he was gone, no one had the authority or vision to lead. The Soviet space program splintered, rival design bureaus fought like wolves over scraps of funding and direction. One group favored the N-1 rocket massive and untested, another clung to outdated capsule designs. No one could agree. And unlike NASA, where transparency and cohesion ruled at least outwardly, the Soviets operated under a fog of secrecy. There were no televised launches, no congressional hearings, no public debates, only classified failures and sudden disappearances. Take for instance the N-1 rocket itself, a beast of engineering with 30 engines in its first stage, far more than the Saturn V. Ambitious? Absolutely. Stable? Absolutely not. Without adequate static testing, the rocket was launched and promptly exploded. And it did this not once but 4 times. One explosion in 1969 was so violent that it left a crater larger than a football field. Flames shot hundreds of meters into the air, turning night to day across the Kazakh desert. But the Soviet people never heard a word, not one photo, not one headline. Meanwhile, the United States was moving from Gemini to Apollo like a freight train. Yes, there had been disasters. The Apollo 1 fire killed 3 astronauts on the launch pad. But each tragedy was broadcast, mourned, and investigated. It created a sense of shared risk. When Apollo 11 launched, it wasn't just a government program, it felt like a national mission. In contrast, Soviet citizens were given little more than slogans. Socialism conquers the cosmos. Communism means progress. But progress, at least toward the moon, had stalled. And deep inside the walls of Baikonur, some engineers started to whisper that it might never happen. The The leadership, faced with mounting costs and repeated failures, quietly shelved the crude lunar plan. Officially, it had never existed, and if it never existed well, it couldn't have failed. Here's a detail you likely haven't heard. Before the Soviets actually did land objects on the moon, their lunar program, particularly Luna 2 and Luna 9, managed to crash and then gently land unmanned probes well before Apollo 11. Luna 9 even sent back images from the lunar surface in 1966, the first photos ever taken from the moon's soil. But it wasn't the same. Not to the world, not to the public, not even to the Kremlin. By 1969, with Apollo 11 counting down, the Soviet Union had no backup, no contingency. Their last hope had gone up in flames, literally. And so when Armstrong stepped onto the moon, Soviet broadcasters clapped politely, then quickly changed the subject. Cosmonauts were told to say nothing. Engineers buried their plans, and Korolev's dream was sealed inside filing cabinets, stamped, classified, and stored away under the weight of national shame. But some things couldn't be locked up. In the following years, disillusionment began to set in among some segments of Soviet youth. If the USSR had always been first, why weren't they on the moon? What had happened? Why hadn't they even tried? These questions lingered uncomfortably in a society trained to believe it was always ahead. And without answers, suspicion bloomed. Maybe the Americans didn't go at all, they'd whisper in cramped dormitories and over late-night vodka. The Soviets never directly accused the US of faking the moon landing in any official capacity. But the vacuum of narrative was enough. Conspiracy, like mold, thrives in shadow, and the USSR had created the perfect conditions. It's strange, isn't it, that one man, unseen, uncelebrated in his own lifetime, had carried an entire nation's cosmic ambition. When he died, the dream didn't just fade, it collapsed. And what was left behind wasn't just technical failure, but something deeper, a mistrust of truth itself.
Yeah.
So now, with Korolev's ghost still lingering over a program that never fully took flight, you stand somewhere far from lunar dust in the fluorescent corridors of a US museum where a glass case gleams under a spotlight. Inside it sits a rock. Not just any rock, but one that supposedly came from the moon. Speckled grey, ancient, porous, older than any stone ever found on Earth. Children press their noses to the display. Parents squint at the plaque. Tour guides whisper the script brought back from the Sea of Tranquility by Apollo 11, 1969. You inch closer, but the rock doesn't speak. It doesn't glow. It just sits there, mute, motionless, a lump of geological proof. And yet outside this air-conditioned room halfway across the world, a man in a smoky Soviet flat is laughing. That's not a moon rock, he says. That's something from Arizona. Because the moon landing had happened, sure, but now came the harder part, convincing the world it happened. And for some, especially those in the Soviet Union and the wider Eastern Bloc, the American triumph didn't feel real. Too clean, too convenient, too filmed. The photos came first, dozens of them, Armstrong and Aldrin standing like cardboard cutouts in front of an inky black sky. No stars, strange shadows, perfect framing, as if NASA had hired a wedding photographer to tag along on a space mission. Conspiracy theorists quickly pounced. Why are the shadows going in different directions? Why is the flag flapping? There's no wind on the moon. Why do some photos look too well lit? The questions kept piling up, and NASA, for all its engineering brilliance, wasn't always quick with a PR-friendly answer. Here's the mainstream historical fact: the American flag didn't actually flap. It had a horizontal rod sewn into the top to keep it extended, which created the illusion of movement in low gravity. But go explain that to a half-skeptical radio announcer in Minsk in 1971, or to a Cuban television station where the footage looked suspiciously like a scene out of Destination Moon, 1950. Truth doesn't always win over aesthetics. The moon rocks were meant to silence the doubters. Apollo missions brought back 382 kilograms of lunar material, basaltic dusty, radiated by cosmic rays. NASA shared samples with over 100 countries. Even the Soviets received a sliver, though they never publicly embraced it. Some of these rocks have since been dated to over 3.7 billion years old, which for context is much older than anything found on Earth's surface. But here's a quirky twist. In 2009, a moon rock gifted to the Netherlands by the US was tested and turned out to be petrified wood. Whoops. Historians still argue whether these kinds of blunders helped fuel conspiracy theories or whether they merely served as distractions for a public already swimming in suspicion. What's undeniable is that the 1970s birthed the beginning of organized moon denial. Pamphlets circulated, books were published, radio hosts invited skeptics on air. And while most of this originated in the West, the Soviet Union, through silence winks and the occasional KGB smirk, allowed these rumors to echo behind the Iron Curtain. Even within the scientific community, some eyebrows lifted, if only briefly. Soviet astronomers, cut off from Western data, had no way to independently confirm certain telemetry details. Their own observatories had not been calibrated to track every moment of Apollo 11's descent. And so a small but persistent sliver of academia said, "We can't be sure." They didn't say it often or loudly. But in a system where doubt had to hide behind metaphors, those silences said enough. Back in the United States, NASA was busy moving forward. Apollo 12 launched months later. Then Apollo 14. Then the iconic Apollo 15 mission, complete with a dune buggy. The Americans weren't just visiting the moon, they were joyriding on it. Yet even as the missions continued, public interest began to wane. The novelty wore off, viewership dropped. And for those outside the US, especially those under governments invested in Soviet prestige, the continuing American success felt less like fact and more like overacted theater. You can almost picture it: a father in Bulgaria sitting with his son, flipping through an old black and white magazine. A photo of an astronaut standing alone, holding a rock. "That's not real," the father says. "Look at the shadow. They did that on a sound stage." "But why?" the son asks, and the father shrugs. "Because the Americans needed a win." That's the heart of the argument. Not the science, not the physics, but the need. In a Cold War defined by nuclear threats, proxy wars and propaganda, the moon was never just a rock in the sky. It was a symbol, and symbols can be molded, doubted, weaponized. In that sense, the American flag on the moon was a Rorschach test. To some it meant triumph, to others, deception. And as the moon rocks sat quietly in their cases, timeless, silent, immobile, the arguments grew louder. You might think rocks would settle things, but humans? We've never really trusted rocks, have we? You blink once, and the sterile museum air dissolves into something warmer, dustier, and oddly cinematic. Somewhere in your mind's eye, you find yourself not on the moon, not in Houston, but on a film set, long shadows cast from bright, unnatural lights, a vast black backdrop stretching forever, and in the middle, a man with a megaphone shouting, "Cut." The air smells like hot wires and aluminum foil. In the corner, Stanley Kubrick adjusts his camera lens, or so the theory goes. By the 1970s, even as NASA wrapped up its final Apollo missions, a parallel narrative was gaining steam, not in technical journals or launch pads, but in living rooms, late-night talk shows, and eventually fringe documentaries. The moon landing had become too cinematic, too perfect, too Hollywood. And at the center of this suspicion was one oddly persistent rumor that the moon landing was staged, and Stanley Kubrick, the visionary director behind 2001: A Space Odyssey, had helped film it. It sounds ridiculous, but you'd be surprised how many people entertained the idea. Kubrick's film had premiered in 1968, a year before Apollo 11, and its lunar sets were so realistic, so eerily lit and sterile, that even NASA engineers reportedly admired them. Some conspiracy theorists claimed that NASA was so impressed, they hired Kubrick to recreate the moon just in case. You know, a little backup footage. The theory ballooned into full-blown myth. A mockumentary titled Dark Side of the Moon, 2002, even parodied the idea, tricking a number of viewers into thinking it was real. Some pointed to Kubrick's famously obsessive control over lighting and detail as evidence. Others claimed to spot clues in his later film The Shining, interpreting the child's Apollo 11 sweater and the geometric carpet as coded confessions. Kubrick never addressed the theory directly, but let's be honest, if he had helped fake the moon landing, would he really have admitted it? But beyond Kubrick, the broader critique remained: the footage looked too good. The grainy black and white quality, the long continuous shots, the way the astronauts seemed to float rather than walk, all of it fed into a visual unease. It looks like a movie, people said, because it is a movie. Here's your quirky fact of the night: NASA didn't actually have high-resolution film cameras on the moon. The footage most people saw was a scan of a TV screen being rebroadcast, hence the low quality and ghostly movements. The original tapes accidentally recorded over in the 1980s. Yes, really, the best visual proof of humanity's greatest achievement was recycled to save money on magnetic tape. Oops. Historians still argue whether that little archival blunder contributed more to the conspiracy than anything else. After all, who erases the moon landing footage? That's like shredding the Constitution because you needed scrap paper. But NASA wasn't operating under mythic expectations. They were a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies do stupid things. Back on the conspiracy front, skeptics analyzed the videos frame by frame. Some claimed wires were visible supporting the astronauts as they hopped. Others measured shadows and angles, swearing the lighting came from multiple sources. A studio setup, not the single harsh sun of the lunar surface. And then there was the flag. Oh, the flag. It seemed to move in a breeze that didn't exist. Never mind the explanation about the horizontal rod or the inertia from being planted. It looked suspicious, and for many that was enough. Meanwhile, inside Soviet circles, these doubts were quietly encouraged. Not overtly, of course. The Soviet government never officially claimed the moon landing was faked, but the whispers were useful. Propaganda doesn't always shout. Sometimes it only needs to shrug. Soviet press occasionally reprinted Western critiques, especially when they came from American voices. A US scientist questioning NASA perfect. A fringe author selling a book titled "We Never Went to the Moon, Even Better." These stories found their way into Soviet classrooms, news bulletins, and discussions among the intellectual elite. It wasn't about truth, it was about plausibility. If the Americans might have lied, then Soviet failure wasn't failure, it was merely resistance to deception. And back in America, the debate was getting louder. Public trust in institutions was eroding. Watergate was just around the corner. Vietnam protests filled the streets. If the government could lie about war, about surveillance, about civil rights, why not the moon? That's the thing about conspiracy theories. They don't thrive on facts. They thrive on doubt. And the moon landing, for all its triumph, was the perfect target, grand symbolic remote. No average citizen could visit the moon and check. It was the ultimate unreachable place, a perfect screen on which to project whatever story you wanted to believe. So when you close your eyes tonight, picture this: a massive sound stage deep in the Nevada desert. Bright studio lights, a painted backdrop, an astronaut sweating inside a costume, taking one giant leap onto a foam rock. The director nods. Cut, print, history rewritten.
Do you believe it?
Of course not. Probably. You lift your gaze from the imaginary film set and look upward, far, far above, where camera tricks and conspiracy theories fester. There, floating silently in low Earth orbit, are the true eyes of the Cold War satellites. Dozens of them operated by both superpowers, endlessly circling the planet like silent referees in a game that no one wanted to lose. And in July 1969, these metal watchers weren't just collecting weather data or relaying TV signals. They were spying, mapping, observing, measuring rocket trails and thermal footprints with quiet, relentless precision. Because here's what many forget: while the public debated shadows and Kubrick, the Soviet Union had all the tools to know the truth. Not guess, no. Their spy satellites, including the powerful Zenit series, had telescopic cameras capable of snapping clear images of rocket launches and even footprints on test sites. The CIA too kept a very close eye on Baikonur, and vice versa. Every time a Saturn V lit up the Florida sky, Soviet analysts were watching. The moon landing wasn't a surprise. The Soviets tracked the launch, they tracked the trajectory. They listened to the radio signals. There were dozens of amateur radio operators around the world, some in Australia, others in West Germany, who triangulated the transmissions themselves, completely independent of NASA. If it was a hoax, it would have had to fool not only Americans but also foreign scientists, neutral countries, hobbyists with antennas, and of course the Kremlin. But despite this mountain of telemetry and hard data, suspicion still clung like lunar dust. In the backrooms of Soviet military intelligence, some analysts scratched their heads over the landing footage. Others compared orbital patterns, satellite photos, launch exhausts. And there were moments, brief, chilled silences, when someone asked, what if the Americans staged part of it just to be sure? This brings us to the Saturn V rocket. It was real, enormous, tremendously loud. Eyewitnesses from miles away felt the Earth tremble beneath them as the engines fired. The Saturn V remains the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. But in Soviet boardrooms, a theory circulated that perhaps the upper stages weren't what they seemed. Some speculated that only the lower stages fired, sending a capsule into orbit for a loop, while the moon footage was broadcast from somewhere on Earth. Sounds ridiculous, maybe, but consider the times it wasn't about what was true, it was about what could be believed. Here's your fringe detail for the night. Soviet scientists at the Keldysh Institute of Applied Mathematics, the same folks running orbital models for Soyuz, allegedly ran their own calculations during Apollo 11. They claimed the trajectory matched a lunar mission. But when asked to present their findings publicly, their reports were buried, not redacted, not disproven, just quietly filed away. Because acknowledging American success meant acknowledging Soviet failure. Historians still argue whether the Soviet leadership wanted the public to believe in the moon landing or not. The Politburo never launched a formal denial. No major Soviet official stood at a podium to declare fake news. Instead, they played a clever game. They allowed disbelief to ferment naturally. No need to lie, just keep truth vague enough that people fill the gaps with their own doubts. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the CIA was busy too. They knew the Soviets were watching. They wanted them to see everything. In fact, some declassified memos suggest NASA deliberately made Apollo's telemetry systems open access, allowing even foreign embassies to receive mission data. It was a strategic move, transparency as propaganda. We're not hiding anything. Go ahead, tune in. But that didn't stop the speculation. Some in the Soviet media later suggested that if the Americans did go to the moon, maybe it was only once. The other missions, Apollos 12 through 17, were just staged repeats, puff pieces to maintain momentum. After all, who goes 6 times to the moon? In just 3 years, even Americans started to question the sheer frequency. That's the paradox of success. When you do something incredible, once people call you a pioneer. When you do it repeatedly, they call you a fraud. By the mid-1970s, Soviet spy satellites had improved dramatically. If they'd wanted to find astronaut footprints on the moon, they might have tried. But even the most advanced satellite couldn't quite make out bootprints from Earth orbit. The moon was just too far. And so the Kremlin could still maintain that faint veneer of uncertainty. No confirmation, no denial. And in that space, in that quiet zone between fact and fiction, grew the argument. Not between generals or engineers, but between citizens. You could hear it in the cafes of Novosibirsk, in the student dorms of Prague, in the late-night broadcasts of shortwave radio buffs in East Berlin. Do you think they really landed? If they did, why didn't we? Wouldn't we have known by now? And maybe the most chilling thought of all, if the Soviets had proof it was fake, wouldn't they have exposed it immediately? They had every incentive, every resource, every reason to call America's bluff. But they didn't. So perhaps in some darkened Kremlin office, an old general stared at the charts, listened to the radio crackle with Armstrong's voice and muttered, "Well, damn, they actually did it." You find yourself now perched on a rusting metal tower deep inside Baikonur Cosmodrome, long after midnight wind slicing across the steppe stars above you, so sharp they feel like they could cut. And somewhere below, in a dim control room, a reel-to-reel tape spins slowly, playing back a sound barely anyone else ever heard. Static, a heartbeat then. Nothing. Because while America was celebrating their Apollo triumphs with parades and postage stamps, the Soviet Union was having different conversations. Private ones, uneasy ones, the kind of hushed late-night talks where no one used names and no one left with written notes. And at the center of these whispers was a question not of if the Americans had gone, but whether the Soviets themselves had already tried and failed. Not with robots, not with probes, with people, cosmonauts, men who may have launched into the void and simply never come back. These were the so-called lost cosmonauts, a fringe theory that, unlike American moon hoax, tales gained eerie traction both inside and outside the USSR. According to this story, long before Gagarin's triumphant orbit in 1961, the Soviet Union had sent other humans into space, secret launches, experimental craft, no fanfare, no news coverage. And when things went wrong, as they often did, those missions were buried, literally and figuratively. You lean closer to one particularly persistent rumor, a series of mysterious radio signals intercepted by Italian amateur operators, the Giudica Cordiglia brothers, in the early 60s. In one chilling recording, a woman's voice, speaking Russian, pleads for help as her capsule overheats. "Can you hear me? I am hot. I am burning." The voice fades into static. No official Soviet mission matched the date. Now even most serious historians dismiss these as hoaxes or misinterpretations. But that didn't stop them from echoing across the Iron Curtain. People wanted to believe. And more importantly, they wanted to explain the gaps, the secrecy, the silence. Because here's the thing, the Soviets were launching experimental missions. The Voskhod program, the early Soyuz designs, they were all incredibly risky. There were test flights, some manned, some not. And yes, some ended badly. Vladimir Komarov, for example, died in 1967 when his Soyuz 1 capsule smashed into the ground after a parachute failure. His funeral was public, but the full details weren't. He became, in some tellings, the martyr of a program trying too hard to catch up. And if failures like Komarov's were public, what else might have stayed hidden? So when Americans walked on the moon and the USSR said little, people began to wonder, was it not just about envy or propaganda or disbelief, but shame? Had the Soviets tried to beat them and failed so spectacularly, so fatally, that the only option was silence? You hear another rumor, this one from inside the cosmonaut corps. It's said that when the Apollo 11 landing was broadcast, a few senior Soviet pilots watched from a training center in Star City. When Armstrong set foot on the surface, there was no clapping, just a long silence. Then one officer, reportedly with glassy eyes, whispered, "They made it. And we will never get there." Here's your fringe tidbit. In the 1980s, a Western journalist uncovered Soviet tracking logs that included unexplained signals from deep space around the time of Apollo. Some claimed it was evidence the Soviets were monitoring the mission in real time. Others said the signals weren't American at all, but the final ghostly pings of a cosmonaut lost in orbit. Unproven, but unsettling. Historians still argue whether the Soviet space program had any realistic path to beat Apollo. The consensus leans toward no. The N-1 was too unstable, the infighting too fierce, and with Korolev gone, no one had the technical gravitas or the political pull to push through. But it's what was believed that mattered. In the absence of open records, stories festered. Some Soviet citizens speculated their government had covered up not just failures but entire missions. And this created a bizarre double effect. Not only did they suspect the Americans of lying about success, they suspected their own leaders of lying about failure. It was a truth sandwich with propaganda on both sides. And the Americans didn't help much. NASA wasn't in the business of defending itself from wild theories. When asked about Soviet rumors, they'd shrug. "We have the rocks, the photos, the data," they'd say. But in a Cold War built on suspicion, silence can be an invitation. You return to that reel-to-reel machine listening again. Static. A voice barely audible. It could be a hoax, or it could be history erased. Either way, it whispers a chilling question. Who would you believe, the people who told you they reached the moon, or the ones who said nothing at all? You fast forward through the crackling tape and emerge decades later, not into a control room or a rocket hangar, but into the humming glow of early internet cafes and message boards. The Cold War is over, the Soviet Union has dissolved, and Neil Armstrong has aged into legend. But here in the pixelated realm of dial-up and Web 1.0, the moon landing debate is anything but dead. In fact, it's enjoying a revival. Only now the arguments don't come from party apparatchiks or cosmonaut engineers. They come from anonymous screen names and blinking avatars armed not with classified memos, but with Photoshop. The battleground has shifted. No longer confined to smoky Soviet kitchens or whispered KGB files, the moon debate now rages on forums like above top-secret conspiracy news groups and even YouTube. Everyone's suddenly an expert in shadow angles, radiation belts, and bootprint physics. And the line between legitimate skepticism and gleeful trolling has never been blurrier. You scroll through a thread, a user named Moonman88 posts a side-by-side comparison of frame from Apollo 11 next to a screenshot from 2001, A Space Odyssey. Look at the lighting, they shout. Same shadows, same angles. Kubrick told us, and no one listened. Replies come pouring in, some supportive, others mocking. One user types in all caps, NASA. Never a straight answer. This new wave of suspicion doesn't come from Soviet cynicism. It comes from American disillusionment. It's the late 90s now. Watergate is ancient history, but its legacy of mistrust lingers. The CIA's misdeeds have been declassified. The Iraq War looms. And the internet, still in its digital adolescence, is a wild west of information. For every astrophysicist calmly explaining why the Van Allen radiation belts wouldn't have fried the astronauts, there's a grainy video with ominous music claiming they would have died instantly. Here's a quirky little ripple in all this. In 2001, Fox aired a special called Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon? It reached millions. Interviews with experts questioned everything from flag movement to crosshairs on the photos. NASA was caught off guard, not by the claims they'd heard them all before, but by how many people wanted to believe them. It wasn't just a theory anymore, it was entertainment. Historians still argue whether the early 2000s internet accelerated the spread of moon denial or merely revealed its persistence, but there's no doubt that something shifted. The moon landing was no longer a closed case. It had become a meme, a template for doubting anything. If they lied about the moon, what else did they lie about? The slope was slippery, and more than a few slid straight into flat Earth and lizard people. NASA tried to respond. They released statements, pointed to third-party confirmations, even trotted out Buzz Aldrin. He famously punched a conspiracy theorist in the face. Probably not the most persuasive method, but undeniably satisfying. They even published educational materials for teachers how to talk to students who believed the landing was faked. That's right, it had crept into classrooms now. And let's be honest, some of the visual evidence did look weird. The crosshairs printed on Apollo photos sometimes appeared behind objects. This was due to overexposure, but try explaining that to an online audience armed with MS Paint and too much time. The lack of blast marks beneath the lunar module. Lunar dust behaves differently. The slow-motion hops of astronauts, perfectly consistent with 1/6 gravity, but yes, they look oddly graceful, as if rehearsed. By the mid-2000s, YouTube exploded with proof videos. Top 10 reasons the moon landing was a hoax. Watch this and you'll never believe NASA again. The thumbnails were lurid red circles, arrows, glowing-eyed astronauts. And the comments, a carnival of doubt, sarcasm, and the occasional doctoral-level physics takedown buried beneath 300 emojis and flame wars. You click on one video, the narrator is calm, conspiratorial. If we really landed on the moon, he asks, why haven't we been back? You sigh because you know the answer. Public interest waned, funding dried up, and Mars became the new dream. But for the online masses, that explanation feels thin, unsatisfying, like an excuse from a kid who lost his homework. Meanwhile, real scientists were doing real science. In 2009, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter snapped high-resolution images of Apollo landing sites. You could see the descent stages, the rover tracks, even the astronauts' footprints still intact after 40 years. But here's the kicker: skeptics just moved the goalpost. Those photos were fake too, they said. CGI. You can't win against someone whose answer to proof is more disbelief. So here you are, lost in the comment threads, the rabbit holes, the backrooms of internet skepticism. And you realize something: this isn't just about the moon. It never was. It's about control, about the comfort of thinking you know a hidden truth, that you're smarter than the masses, that while others sleep you see the strings. The moon, in this version of history, becomes less a destination and more a screen onto which we project every doubt we've ever harbored. It reflects not just sunlight, but every flicker of our paranoia. And somehow, despite the photos, the samples, the testimonies, and the decades of silence from the Soviets, this argument still burns. Not because it's true, but because it could be. And now you're standing on cracked concrete under an open Kazakh sky, the air dry and stretched, thin wind curling around rusted launch towers and abandoned hangars. Welcome back to Baikonur Cosmodrome, the very heart of the Soviet space program, or at least what's left of it. You're here not for a launch, but for a memory. The kind that lingers in the dust, in the hushed conversations of old workers who still haunt the site, their uniforms faded, their loyalty intact, but their eyes a little more amused now. You approach a technician, call him Sergei, who once handled telemetry back in the 1960s. He squints at the sun and offers you a cigarette he never lights. You ask him about the moon landing, and a faint smile plays on his lips, the kind that suggests either amusement or a secret he'll never tell. "They landed," he finally mutters. "Of course they did." Then a beat later, he shrugs. Or maybe not. Either way, we didn't. This is the mood you find at Baikonur today. Not denial, not bitterness, but something softer. Irony, maybe. The grand space race, so heated, so high stakes, has aged into a kind of nostalgia. And for the people who once lived it, the lines between truth, politics, and myth have long since blurred. Back in the 1970s, Baikonur was a closed city, a secret city, one that didn't appear on maps. Here launches were tested, rockets were cobbled together, and hopes were burned, sometimes literally. You're walking past a concrete bunker now, the paint peeling off in long curls, and someone's scrawled a crude image of the Saturn V on the wall. Underneath it reads, in Russian, "They made it." So what? Because for many who labored here, the moon landing, real or not, became less important than what it represented. To believe in it meant to admit defeat, sure. But to disbelieve it entirely meant to ignore what they themselves had seen, the smoke, the telemetry, the world turning toward the stars. Still, even now, there are holdouts. You duck into a low brick building where a few retired engineers gather over vodka and dried fish. One insists the Americans cheated. They filmed it in Nevada, he grumbles, slapping his glass on the table. Our satellites saw nothing. No module, no blast crater. The others chuckle, roll their eyes, take another swig. Here's your quirky tidbit. For a brief window, in the late 1980s, a declassified Soviet project called Zond was revealed to have aimed for the moon with robotic capsules. They sent turtles around the moon before any American did. In fact, turtles. You can imagine the propaganda headline, "Communist reptiles conquer the moon," but nobody cared, because the public didn't want unmanned robots and reptilian passengers. They wanted boots. They wanted flags. Historians still argue whether Baikonur's silence during Apollo was out of fear or strategy. Some say engineers knew the Americans had pulled it off, but they were muzzled by the state. Others believe the Kremlin deliberately kept their own people guessing, planting just enough doubt to maintain patriotic morale. After all, if your enemy's success might be fake, maybe you didn't really lose. And then there's the deeper, more existential truth you feel standing in the Kazakh dust. For the people who were working on their own lunar missions, who saw them fail, saw dreams shatter. It was easier to joke than to grieve, easier to mock the Americans than to admit privately, painfully, that your own nation's shot at the moon had vanished in a cloud of fire and bureaucracy. You peer into an old hangar, its roof half collapsed, and see the shell of a lunar lander never used. It's not a model, it's not fake. It was meant to go, but it didn't. It never had the chance. Some say it was just weeks from being ready when Apollo 11 launched. Others say it would have never worked. You run your fingers along its scorched hull, and in this moment you realize conspiracy isn't always about fooling others. Sometimes it's about comforting yourself. Back outside, Sergei has disappeared. Maybe he was never really there. Or maybe he got tired of this story long ago. In Baikonur, time doesn't pass the way it should. It folds over on itself like a wrinkled mission report. And everywhere the ghosts of what could have been whisper their own version of history. Was there ever really a debate here? A true belief that Apollo was faked, or was it just an emotional shield raised to protect egos bruised by politics and silence? You may never know. But as the sun sets over Baikonur and the rusted towers stretch long shadows across the steppe, you hear one final voice, low, gravelly, a toast among comrades to the moon, whoever got there first. From the desolate plains of Baikonur, the wind carries you eastward across continents and oceans, back to Washington, D.C., where something else was quietly unraveling. Not a rocket, not a conspiracy, but confidence. Because while the rest of the world stared upward at the stars, one man in the White House was pacing, sweating and worrying that it might all fall apart. You step inside the Oval Office. The year is 1969. Richard Nixon sits behind his desk, stoic as always, though his eyes twitch whenever someone mentions Houston. For all the fireworks and patriotic speeches, Apollo 11 was a terrifying gamble. Billions spent, years of build-up, and at its center, 3 men in a fragile metal can, hundreds of thousands of miles from help. What if they failed? You don't have to imagine too hard. The White House had already prepared for it. Tucked away in a manila folder labeled "In Event of Moon Disaster" was a speech drafted by presidential speechwriter William Safire that Nixon would read if Armstrong and Aldrin were stranded on the moon. It was haunting, poetic, sobering. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. The world would mourn. The astronauts' wives would be called. The transmission would be cut. That speech, of course, was never used, but just its existence sent ripples through history. For conspiracy theorists, it became Exhibit A proof that they had planned for failure so much so that they might have planned for cover-up. After all, if Nixon was ready to lie to the American people in the event of tragedy, could he also lie in the event of embarrassment? And Nixon was not exactly known for transparency. Watergate was still years away, but the seeds were already there. Paranoia, back-channel schemes, the obsession with optics. He feared failure not just because of what it would mean for the country, but what it would do to him. A botched moon landing wasn't just a setback, it was humiliation. And Nixon didn't lose gracefully. Here's your fringe detail. Some conspiracy theorists actually claim Nixon did fake the moon landing, but only after Apollo 11 ran into problems. In this version, the mission was real, until something broke. A missed landing window, a faulty camera. So a decision was made: let the astronauts do the best they could, and meanwhile prepare a plan B, a live feed shot elsewhere, just in case. Historians scoff at this idea, but it's oddly cinematic. Like a Cold War thriller that never needed to be filmed. Historians still argue whether Nixon's administration ever seriously considered faking success. Officially, no documents point in that direction. But unofficially, you're left with the vibe, the tone, the atmosphere of a government so anxious to control the narrative that even the mere thought of failure required a eulogy and a contingency. And then there's the television factor. The Apollo 11 broadcast wasn't just a mission, it was a show. Nixon ensured the world saw it live in real time with commentary music and flag-waving grandeur. Some say that's what made it feel fake, the production value. The narration, the staged solemnity. "We come in peace for all mankind," the plaque on the lander said. But it was Nixon who approved the wording. Nixon who made sure that message reached every living room. He even made a call to the astronauts on the moon, a presidential phone call to another celestial body. "This has to be the most historic telephone call ever made," he said, his voice crisp and confident. The moment was beamed live, seen by hundreds of millions. But technically it wasn't a direct phone call, it was routed through NASA's communication system and pre-timed. Still impressive, but a little less magical than it seemed. And therein lies the tension. The Apollo 11 mission was real, but it was also wrapped in layers of stagecraft. There were speeches, soundtracks, press kits. You could argue the truth didn't need embellishment, but try telling that to a Cold War president whose approval ratings were tethered to lunar success. So when you look at that unused disaster speech yellowed with age, you can't help but feel a shiver. Not because it proves deception, but because it proves just how close failure truly was, and how carefully the illusion of control had to be maintained. Back in 1969, though, it worked. Nixon basked in the glow, America exhaled, and the rest of the world, skeptical, silent, stunned, watched and waited. Because if it had been a hoax, they reasoned this was the moment it would fall apart. By now, you've wandered far from the White House lawn and its carefully polished speeches. You're tucked into a dimly lit Moscow apartment, the wallpaper yellowed and curling the air thick with tobacco and old stories. The television is off, the radio is on, and across from you sits a man who used to know things that were never printed, never broadcast, but never quite forgotten. A former KGB officer long retired with a voice like gravel, and a memory that's only fuzzy when he wants it to be. He pours tea without looking up and mutters, "We knew?" You blink. He stirs in sugar, then adds, "They really landed." Everyone at the top understood. But it was entertaining to let the public think otherwise. And just like that, the veil lifts. Because for all the wild speculation and backyard telescope sleuthing, some of the most telling admissions didn't come from amateur detectives or skeptical professors, but from the very people whose job it was to know. The Soviet intelligence apparatus had watched Apollo 11 unfold with the cold, calculating patience of a chess master. They tracked the launch trajectory, they intercepted transmissions, they analyzed every piece of open-source data available, and in the quiet rooms of power the conclusion was unanimous. The Americans had done it, but the public didn't have to know that. See, the KGB didn't need to shout from the rooftops, they didn't need to denounce the landing, call it fake, or launch a PR campaign. No, they did something far more effective. They let the doubt grow organically. Whispered jokes, odd newspaper phrasing, the casual omission of praise, just enough ambiguity to make people question. After all, what's more powerful than telling a lie, letting someone tell it to themselves? There's your fringe detail for tonight. In the mid-1990s, a former KGB archivist, anonymously of course, claimed that the agency had compiled a full internal report in 1970 confirming Apollo 11's success, complete with launch telemetry, satellite images and voice transmission analysis. It was never released, never published, just quietly filed away because the conclusion wasn't useful. What was useful was the confusion. Historians still argue whether this strategy, this silent admission, was a deliberate form of psychological warfare or just the byproduct of bureaucratic disinterest. Some say the USSR's political elite didn't want to stir up a debate they couldn't control. Others argue it was the perfect Cold War judo move, turn your enemy's victory into an object of suspicion. A moonwalk becomes a magic trick, a footprint becomes a stencil, and suddenly the champion looks a little less noble, a little more desperate. The officer lights a cigarette now, the smoke curling toward the ceiling. "I watched the live feed from a secure facility," he says. "It was delayed, of course, but clear. And no one in that room doubted what we saw." You ask him if there was ever a plan to expose the landing as fake, some brilliant counter-propaganda campaign. He shakes his head. Why would we? They were already making fools of themselves. All we had to do was let the public notice. You think back to the endless forum threads, the late-night YouTube videos, the tourists in museums whispering, "Do you think it really happened?" And you realize maybe they were never the target. Maybe we were always the ones playing catch-up, untangling a myth planted by silence. The KGB didn't need to prove anything. They already had the truth. What mattered was managing belief. And in the 1970s Soviet Union, that meant controlling the conversation without ever appearing to have started it. There were even moments, fleeting, almost absurd, when Soviet officials almost congratulated the Americans. During a reception in Geneva in 1970, a Soviet ambassador reportedly raised his glass and said, "A toast to the Americans for their theatrical achievements." A chuckle passed through the room. No one followed up, because it wasn't about confirming or denying. It was about ambiguity, the kind that seeps into textbooks, dinner tables, and eventually the back of your mind. Here's something more recent. In 2015, Vladimir Markin, a spokesman for Russia's investigative committee, publicly suggested reopening an investigation into the Apollo missions, not to disprove them, he said, but to verify the original film footage. It was framed as a call for transparency, but the timing, tone, and target all raised eyebrows. Some said it was a jab at the West, a gentle reminder that even their proudest moment could be re-examined. And in a world ruled by disinformation, re-examining is often just code for undermining. So you sit with the KGB man, the air gone stale, the tea now cold. He doesn't smile often, but when he does, it's the smile of someone who played the game and never lost, even when he didn't win. The Americans reached the moon, he says, but we never had to chase them down. They came back full of doubt already. And you think maybe that's the most Soviet strategy of all. Let your opponent score the goal, then convince the crowd it was an own goal. You close the door on the KGB man's apartment, stepping back into a world that has since upgraded its microphones, supercharged its conspiracies, and forgotten how to blink. The year is no longer 1969 or 1985 or even 2005. You're now swimming in the luminous chaos of the internet's golden mess, algorithm-fed content loops, gifs of moonwalks edited to Michael Jackson songs, and rabbit holes you never meant to fall into. Welcome to the era where the moon landing conspiracy isn't just a theory, it's content. The early internet was a petri dish of wild speculation, but Web 2.0 turned it into a buffet. You scroll through Reddit threads that sprawl like ancient scrolls, each post dissecting Apollo photos like sacred texts. The lighting, the flag, the missing stars. Then someone posts a meme of Neil Armstrong with laser eyes and the caption, "First man on the moon," or "First man to lie about it." What was once whispered in Cold War kitchens is now shouted in comment sections under videos with auto-tuned narrators and 15 mid-roll ads. These aren't just questions anymore, they're brands. Whole YouTube channels dedicate themselves to debunking the moon lie. TikToks go viral with Gen Z creators walking through proof that NASA filmed it all in a Hollywood basement. There's even a mobile app that lets you simulate faking your own moon landing footage using AI filters. And while it's easy to laugh, to roll your eyes, you can't deny the cleverness. The theory has evolved, no longer the domain of dusty pamphlets and grainy VHS tapes. Moon doubt has gone digital, social, memeable. It's joined the pantheon of lovable internet conspiracies alongside chemtrails, Mandela effects, and flat Earth maps drawn in Microsoft Paint. Here's your fringe gem for the night. A 2019 poll found that nearly 1 in 10 Americans under 30 believed the moon landing was probably or definitely staged. That's not fringe, that's classroom-size belief. That's barbershop debate material. That's TikToks for you page on a Tuesday at midnight. Historians still argue whether this resurgence of moon denial says more about the Apollo program or the modern mind. One camp sees it as harmless curiosity, a generation born into doubt raised on deepfakes, numbed by politics. The other sees it as dangerous erosion. If we can't agree that humans went to the moon with hundreds of hours of footage, thousands of eyewitnesses, physical moon rocks, and third-party tracking, then what can we agree on? In the middle you float, caught in a sea of GIFs showing astronauts bouncing in slow motion, compared side by side with footage from simulated lunar gravity video games. Someone claims the backdrop in Apollo 16 matches a rock formation in Nevada. Another insists Buzz Aldrin's visor reflects a studio light. A third simply says, "Wake up, sheeple," and drops a link to a 5-hour documentary with 10 subscribers. But here's the twist: these videos get views, some with millions. Why? Because doubt is addictive. You're not just learning, you're uncovering. You're not watching history, you're solving a mystery. And what's more exciting than being the one who figured out what billions of others supposedly missed? You scroll through another thread, this one more polished. It links to official NASA reports long-range satellite imagery from Japan's Selene probe and Google Moon overlays showing the exact descent site of Apollo 15. A few comments nod appreciatively, a few call it lies. One user posts, "Just because you have data doesn't mean it's real." You sigh, because in the age of misinformation, data doesn't settle debates, it fuels them. This is no longer about truth or proof. It's about tribes. Are you with the believers or the doubters? Do you trust institutions or question everything? The moon landing in this landscape becomes a litmus test not for historical literacy, but for worldview. It doesn't matter what happened in 1969, what matters is what you're willing to believe in 2025. And now here's the kicker. NASA recently announced plans to return to the moon under the Artemis program. New rockets, new astronauts, new cameras, of course, high definition, 4K live streamed from the stratosphere. A chance to revisit the dusty sea of tranquility, but also, whether they admit it or not, a chance to prove it again. But you already know what'll happen. As soon as boots hit the regolith, someone will zoom in on a shadow, point to a glitch in the stream, ask why the flag ripples again. Because the moon landing hoax isn't about the past. It's about a hunger, a need for mystery in a world where everything feels known, but nothing feels certain. So when you lie in bed tonight and see the moon rising outside your window, know this: it's more than a rock. It's a mirror. And whatever people see in it, triumph, deception, magic, myth, is more about them than the stars themselves. You've drifted far from the static of online forums, now deeper into the territory where suspicion becomes statecraft and history bends into politics. You're standing in a sleek, modern Moscow newsroom years after the fall of the USSR, flat screens, glowing coffee machines humming. This isn't Pravda anymore, it's Russia Today, Sputnik News, social media channels dripping with style and subtlety. And here the moon isn't just a place humans went, it's a soft target for ideological jabs, a perfectly shaped crater in the American myth. You don't see it headlined as a denial. No anchor shouts they never landed, that would be too blunt, too easy to dismiss. Instead, the framing is clever. Why haven't we returned? Could footage from 1969 hold inconsistencies? New Russian investigations demand answers about missing Apollo tapes. These aren't accusations, they're winks, just questions, just enough smoke to get people wondering if there might have been a fire. Enter Vladimir Putin, not as a moon truther, but as a master of narrative. Under his long leadership, the Russian state has found extraordinary power in reviving old grievances and poking at Western claims. And the moon, dear listener, is such a ripe, juicy claim. After all, what says, "We won more loudly than 6 American flags planted on another world"? In this version of modern Russian politics, you don't need to say the Americans faked the moon landing. You just need to remind your citizens that the Americans say they did it, and then let them make up their minds. Distrust is the currency. If they stop believing in the moon, maybe they'll stop believing in NATO, in democracy, in Western truth. That's the goal, not to build a new story, but to unravel the old ones. Here's your quirky little detail. In 2015, as relations between Russia and the US chilled again, the Russian government publicly called for an investigation into why the original Apollo 11 footage was missing. They didn't claim the landing was fake. They just asked why the most important video of the 20th century got taped over. "We're just curious," they said, with a grin. Historians still argue whether the Kremlin's strategy here is intentional, tactical, or just the natural evolution of Cold War cynicism. But there's no denying the pattern. Whether it's Soviet silence in 1969 or Russian investigations in the 2010s, the effect is the same: shake confidence in the American story. Make people hesitate before saying, "Yes, we went to the moon." That hesitation is the victory. Back in Russia, among the general public, attitudes vary. Some still see Gagarin as the only name worth remembering in space history. Others shrug and say, maybe they did, maybe not, does it matter? And for a new generation raised on streaming skepticism and TikTok edits of Apollo 11 with conspiracy captions, the moon landing feels more like a viral rumor than a scientific milestone. You walk into a classroom in St. Petersburg. A student points at a photo of Buzz Aldrin. They say this was filmed in Arizona, she says. The teacher doesn't argue, she just raises an eyebrow. They say a lot of things, and class moves on. It's subtle, you see. Not a rejection, not a fight, just a nudge, a smirk, a planted seed. Meanwhile, the Russian space agency Roscosmos pushes ahead. They plan moon missions of their own. They talk about collaboration with China. They speak softly of lunar mining, of flag planting. And just once in a press conference, a Russian official says with a chuckle, "We'll go see if the American flag is still there." It's a joke, mostly, but it spreads. Because that's the difference now. In the Cold War, doubt was a secret. In the 21st century, it's an export, a gift-wrapped package of just enough mischief to go viral. A post, a headline, a brief segment on Russian state television that ends with a shrug and a raised brow. And back in the West, journalists still ask, why do Russians doubt the moon landing? But maybe the better question is, why do they benefit from doubting it? You glance again at the moon above Moscow, pale and indifferent. It doesn't care who believes in it, it just orbits. But down here, the people watching it are still playing the game. And as long as someone stands to gain from making others unsure, the question will never really go away. And now at the end of this long trail of boot prints and broadcast static, you lie back beneath a sky that looks much the same as it did in 1969. The moon still hangs there, bright indifferent, a glowing coin flipping slowly in the night. But down here the arguments have never stopped, because this was never just about rockets and dust, it was always about belief. You're on your own porch now, or maybe a rooftop, or even lying in bed with headphones and eyes half closed. Somewhere a fan hums. Maybe a dog barks in the distance. But in your mind it's quiet. Just the moon above and the echo of a world that once dreamed and then doubted. The conspiracy, you realize, has become more than just a claim. It's become culture. There are children today who grow up not with the excitement of the Apollo missions, but with TikToks asking if the whole thing was fake. For them, the moon landing isn't dusty history, it's a question mark, a punchline, a piece of recycled doubt with a fresh coat of digital paint. And that's where the argument lives now, not in KGB files or declassified memos, not in satellite footage or museum rocks, but in us, in how we choose to tell the story, in what we pass down, because belief isn't inherited, it's taught. And somewhere along the line, the moon stopped being a destination and became a reflection, a mirror for our suspicions, our need to feel smarter than the official version of events. You remember the teacher who said, "Some Americans say they landed on the moon." You remember the technician in Baikonur who said maybe they did? We didn't. You remember the YouTube comment that simply read, "They lied about that." What else did they lie about? And you start to see the shape of it, the moon landing conspiracy, as comfort, as defiance, as distraction. A tidy rebellion against a world that doesn't always make sense, because if the moon landing was a lie, then maybe everything that overwhelms us is too. Maybe power is hollow, maybe no one is really in control. Here's your last quirky fact. Buzz Aldrin once said he didn't mind the conspiracy theories all that much. They keep people interested, he shrugged. And if they're interested, maybe they'll look a little deeper. He even laughed once when someone asked him what it was like filming the moon landing in a studio. "They wouldn't have let me drive the buggy," he said. "I would have knocked over the camera." Historians still argue whether the moon landing conspiracy helped preserve the mission's cultural relevance or corroded it. Some say it forced us to defend and rediscover the facts. Others believe it pulled attention away from the awe, the science, the unthinkable achievement. But either way, it never went away. It became a part of the story, inseparable, unkillable. And now new boots are being prepped, new missions announced. NASA says Artemis will return humans to the moon soon. This time with better cameras, more sensors, more data. But even before the rockets fire, you already know what will follow. Edited clips, flagged anomalies, blurry freeze frames. The question will return like a comet. Is this one real? Because in the end, the conspiracy isn't just a theory, it's a ritual. It's part of how we deal with the overwhelming, the unimaginable. We doubt what we cannot touch. We mock what we secretly fear might be true. We argue, and in doing so, we make the moment last. And so here you are, at the end of the long tale. You didn't solve it, you didn't need to. You simply floated through the decades, listened to the ghosts, weighed the laughter and the silence. And now, under that pale, ancient light, you understand. What people believe about the moon says more about Earth. The moon is still there, round and steady in the sky, silent as ever. It's watched us bicker and build doubt and dream. It's watched rockets rise, flags unfurl, and generations grow up wondering how we ever reached so high, or if we did at all. But now the stars are a little blurrier, and your body's softer in the bed or couch you're curled into. The hum of the day is fading. You've heard the stories. You've walked alongside the dreamers and the skeptics. You've seen how a single event, one step, onto grey, lifeless soil can ripple outward into endless questions, arguments, jokes and pride. And it's okay to still feel uncertain, to wonder, to look up at that glowing coin in the sky and say, maybe. Not everything has to be settled tonight. So take a slow breath, let your eyelids grow heavier. You're safe here. No launch countdowns, no broadcast fuzz. Just the gentle turning of the earth beneath you and the steady hum of time moving forward. Somewhere far above, the footprints remain, untouched, unbothered by our doubts, waiting.
Let them wait a little longer.
You've done enough for tonight. Sleep well, and when you dream, maybe dream of stars.